All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. I'm going to start a new series that I'm going to be doing on Hegel, and I'm going to format this video a little bit differently. So, let me see. I'm going to share my screen here and show you a picture of Hegel and my entire screen. And oh, just a Chrome tab, actually. Oh, that's good. I can go between different tabs. I didn't know that. So, okay, so that's good. So go to this one here and show you a picture of Hegel for those of you who haven't seen him. This is a funny picture that someone edited, of course, at putting sunglasses on him and a cigarette in his mouth. And he's also got some bling there too, which is pretty cool. So I'm doing a series on Hegel's aesthetics, and I would say that it's just a philosophical topic that I've gotten really interested in, particularly with learning a little bit about Hegel from the series that I did with Chief Keef, aka Tim Keefe, about other philosophers, the discussions we've done about Heidegger and all the post-structuralist philosophers like Foucault and Derrida and other philosophers, and how they were influenced by Hegel and how Hegel was influenced by them. And you can go into Kant. And so what I'm doing to make this more interesting is I'm going to learn about Hegel's aesthetics through the work of other philosophers' interpretations of him, especially since he's notoriously difficult to understand, like a lot of the philosophers who I end up choosing to cover. Um, so I'm starting this series with Slavoj Ziziek, and I'm going to show you a picture here as well. And he is a Slovenian philosopher, and he's really cool because he's kind of like abstract and difficult to understand sometimes too, to be honest. And I'll show you a picture here. I think this is the right one. Oh wait, no, not that one. This one. So yeah, this is I just thought this was a funny picture of Slavoj Žižek. And yeah, like I said, he's a very interesting and down-to-earth guy with some abstract ideas, like a lot of philosophers, and he has some really cool and funny opinions, and to the point that he's a Marxist, and I'm definitely not a Marxist, but I think his arguments for it are compelling, and everything he says is really interesting, even if I disagree with it, and he's just so knowledgeable about what he writes about. And yeah, this is the picture I accidentally went to first there because what if some of you have not heard of Slavoj Žižek before, he is of course most well known, probably most recently anyway, for debating Jordan Peterson about Marxism. And I've often criticized Jordan Peterson, and like I often try to say when I'm discussing him, I think he makes some good points, and he's helped a lot of people, and I'm glad that he recovered from that scare that he had with getting addicted to benzodiazepines and having a really rough time with it, to say the least. But anyway, he, of course, as I often say whenever I'm talking about philosophy, particularly so-called postmodernist philosophers, he doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about when it comes to philosophy. And he clearly, from this debate, doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about when it comes to Marxism either. I think they actually had a pretty constructive and civilized debate, so it's worth watching if you guys haven't seen it. But he admitted before the debate that all he's read about Marxism is the Communist Manifesto. And like I said, I'm no expert on Marxism, but Slavoj Žižek has written, like, I don't know how many books, but at least 10 books, and Jordan Peterson read none of them. And like I said, all he read about Marxism was the Communist Manifesto, and it was clear that he didn't really know what he was talking about, and Slavoj Žižek understood it a lot better. But anyway, I'm also going to share my screen here because one other distinctive thing about him is that he talks in a funny voice, and he talks like, and he sniffles a lot and touches his nose, so he's got very characteristic mannerisms there. So I'm going to share this screen too, and I'm just going to show you like a few seconds of him talking. I don't know what's going on with this window here. Oh, there we go. There we go.
There is in this attacks of Habermasian rationalists and so on Heidegger, in this, to put it bluntly, their attempt to criminalize Heidegger. There is something much more ominous going on. I claim that if you really look at it in detail, you discover that the true enemy is not even so much Heidegger. What they want to criminalize is a certain fundamental doubt in enlightenment, which you find even in Adorno and Benjamin. And even
so, yeah, that's basically just giving you a little taste there of what Slavoj Ziziek sounds like. He's kind of like hard to understand, because for people in our Western culture anyway, if you're in the Western culture watching this, because we're not used to his Slovenian accent, and he has that weird sort of speech impediment, or I don't know, whatever that is. But anyway, check him out if you haven't seen him before. I think he's a really interesting thinker. Anyway, I just wanted to establish those few things here. And so, like I said, in my series I'm doing on Hegel's aesthetics, I'm starting with Slavoj Ziziek, and the book that I'm starting with here is called Less Than Nothing, and I'll show that on the screen here too. And this is basically about Hegel's dialectics, Hegel in the shadow of dialectical materialism. So dialectical materialism is a very specific idea that Hegel came up with, and I'm honestly not totally clear on what that means. I have a vague idea, but anyway, I'm reading this book, like I said, mostly to explore Hegel's ideas on aesthetics. And so this is that book, Less Than Nothing, and I'm going to talk in this video about an essay in chapter 1, and it's about the way, the morality and aesthetics of depicting the Holocaust in fiction. So I'll show the picture that I had for the thumbnail for the video here. Of course, a lot of pictures about the Holocaust are fucking horrifying, of course, right? So I'm going to go to that here and just show for a moment. So that's a fucking terrible picture of a starving Holocaust victim and a child. Not just that, but a child as well, of course. And that's obviously fucking horrifying. And so this essay, I believe that it's in chapter 1, and it's called Vacillating the Semblances, What Cannot Be Said Must Be Shown. And I think it's a very fascinating essay. Just even getting into the subject of how the Holocaust should be depicted in fiction, and the morality of whether you even should depict it or not. So yeah, now that I've established that that's what it's about here, I'm just going to go through my thoughts on the essay in general. And so anyway, Slavoj Žižek starts off with talking about Wittgenstein, and I'll show you a picture of Wittgenstein here. He's also another very famous philosopher, and particularly for, among other things, for his two theories on language. So this is Wittgenstein here, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So he had two theories of language, and he had one earlier in his career and one that he sort of changed his mind on later in his career. Earlier on, I always get confused about which one came first, but I believe that at first he thought that you could find some sort of structure for language and how language works, and then later on he had this he developed this theory that language is all just kind of like language games, like we invent rules to suit our purposes for living in the world, which makes a lot of sense to me. So the first thing that, like I said, Slavoj Ziziek starts off by talking about Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein, he mentions Wittgenstein's theory in his Tractatus, which is one of his only 2 published books, and that's about one of his theories of language. And so he mentions Wittgenstein's very famous quote, "Whereof one cannot speak, one must be silent," in his Tractatus. And he says that it reflects the dominant attitudes toward depicting the Holocaust in fiction at the time that he wrote this anyway. Don't talk about it because you haven't experienced it. And we've all pretty much heard of this opinion before, right? If you haven't experienced it, you shouldn't talk about it. And it also relates to this trope that you hear from authors that sometimes that, which is write what you know, which I think is pretty fucking stupid, to be honest. And I agree more with what Stephen King says about that. Why would you write what you know? That's just boring. Just maybe apply what you know to totally new concepts and do it in a realistic way, which is what Stephen King is a fucking expert at, right? Especially when you're writing about all these fascinating kaleidoscopic ideas like supernatural horror and demons and dead people coming back to life and all sorts of really fucked up and horrifying shit. And I'm sure lots of other authors agree with that as well. So that's why I think this idea is stupid, and I think it's also why Slavoj Žižek criticizes it. Well, that's actually not exactly why he criticizes it, but it's a good reason to criticize it, because that would be, and also it's different because like an aspect of this is morality, right? So it's getting into the morality of depicting this, and obviously people have conflicting thoughts of this because we're talking specifically about the Holocaust and the horror of that. And it's understandable that some people can think that depicting the Holocaust is immoral if you didn't experience it, because you're maybe causing psychological harm to Holocaust survivors or something similar. And so it can be understandable, but you could also argue that it's more moral in a way to depict it, because then you can show people how horrifying it is, and because one of the great utilities of history is to show people how horrifying history has been, to learn the lessons from it and avoid making those mistakes in the future. So anyway, what Slavoj Žižek says about Wittgenstein's notion, whereof one cannot speak, one must be silent. This is what he mentions what other authors say about that. So first he describes that some authors believe that documentary is impossible after the Holocaust. And then while others, like Elie Wiesel, who is a famous Holocaust survivor who wrote this novel called The Night, which is about his experience during the Holocaust. So he thinks that fiction is impossible after the Holocaust. And this is interesting too, because like I don't really understand, because he doesn't describe in that paragraph or get more into what specifically these people mean. But it's interesting because they're extreme opinions, right? But if you try to understand it, why would documentary be impossible after the Holocaust? Maybe it's this idea that truth is stranger than fiction, and also like more horrifying than fiction, or maybe no, because that would be so. Yeah, like you can't possibly. I guess this applies more to the claim that fiction would be impossible, because truth is stranger than fiction, which means that you cannot or more horrifying than fiction in terms of the Holocaust specifically. that means that you cannot possibly come up with anything as horrifying in fiction as the Holocaust in reality. You can see how someone would think that. I disagree. Like, for example, some of the shit that authors like Stephen King and others have written is probably fucking more horrifying to me than at least what I've read about the Holocaust. But this gets into how some people claim that documentary is impossible because I'm assuming, if I had to guess, the idea would be that, you know, if you're watching a documentary or reading a nonfiction book about the Holocaust, then no matter how horrifying and detailed it gets, you're still just barely scratching the surface of what actually happened. Like I think obviously, if you're only experiencing that, it's nothing compared to an actual Holocaust survivor or someone who died during the Holocaust. And, you know, I can see that argument too, even though they're kind of extreme opinions, I would say. So after that, in the essay, Slavoj Žižek goes on to talk about Lacan. And one of the reasons I decided to discuss Slavoj Žižek is that he's a Hegelian, so he's a huge fan of Hegel and incorporates him as the structure of his philosophy. He also describes himself as Lacanian, which means that he really tries to apply Lacan to his philosophy, and he talks about him a lot, just like he does with Hegel. And so I'll show a picture of him here as well. And he is, I believe he was a French psychoanalyst. And he had, like, this is him here, looking all cool, smoking actually, that's a cigarette. I thought it was a cigar at first, but it's a cigarette. So anyway, he was really well known for having, like, ideas that are in opposition to some of the even more famous psychoanalysts like Freud and Carl Jung. And I'm honestly not that familiar with his ideas, but like I said, Hegel is a huge fan of his. And so he talks about basically one of Lacan's criticisms of Wittgenstein's idea that if you haven't experienced something, you should not make fiction about it. And basically, what Slavoj Žižek says, he's describing what Lacan as a person and what he thought about it. So Lacan was a famous psychologist and psychoanalyst and an atheist Catholic. He said that, so think about that in terms of his moral compass, right? And I don't it sounds like impossible to some people probably for there to be an atheist Catholic. I don't know exactly what that means. I'm curious to learn more about what that means in terms of how you can reconcile being an atheist with also being a Catholic. Maybe he's culturally Catholic and was raised that way. It's hard to know for sure. So Lacan famously said that truth has a structure of fiction, which I think is interesting because it's almost like when you discover truth, it's like you're discovering new aspects of a reality, and we all construct narratives of what reality is truly like, right? So it can be like a fiction in that way. I don't know if he exactly meant that, but I can say that's how I interpret that anyway. So Lacan said that almost no one can enjoy a snuff film, but we can enjoy torture and killing as fiction. And I think that's really true. Like, you can experience someone getting tortured vicariously in a novel, or most of us have seen in movies and TV shows, the bad guy gets captured and then he gets tortured, or the good guy gets captured and he or she gets tortured. And most of us, like, we're not getting off on it or going to watch a movie specifically for that, but we can handle it. It might even be super fucking disturbing, but it's not going to give you, like, PTSD, at least if you're the average person, because at least one small part of your mind will understand that it's fiction. So you can make this disconnect. So it allows you to vicariously experience the suffering that others have gone through without having to experience it yourself, which makes a lot of sense, I think, right? That's one of the main purposes of fiction. One of the great things about it. So when truth is true, and this is a great direct quote there relating to that. When truth is too dramatic to be confronted directly, it can only be accepted in the guise of a fiction. So if you think about this in terms of the Holocaust is fucking unimaginably horrifying, right? Like, Jews and everyone else who was there, like disabled people, gay people, black people, any Muslim people, anyone, like a long list of people. They would get gassed, get poisoned, get mass executed in concentration camps, get worked to death, get literally slaughtered. Of course, Ivan the Terrible, so the so-called Nazi, was famous for killing any survivors who came out of the gas chambers. And like I said, I'm sure that's barely fucking scratching the surface of how fucking awful it is. So if it's so horrifying that it can be hard to believe that it really happened, right? So one of the advantages of fiction is that you can see like probably a toned down version of the Holocaust, and it can help you accept it as truth, as yes, this fucking fucked up shit actually did happen in history, in reality, in the real world. So I think that's a great quote too. And so then Slavoj Ziziek goes on to say, if we stumbled upon actual footage of Auschwitz inmates being murdered, we should destroy it because it would be too obscene and disrespectful towards the victims. That's interesting. See, I don't think I agree with that in particular, because like, if I found that, I probably would not even want to fucking watch it because I don't want to be that disturbed. But at the same time, I don't think I have the right to conceal that from someone, because it's such a major and important part of history. And I think that it's important for people to know, no matter how disturbing it is. Not me necessarily, but like historians, for example, so that can become a broader part of their entire knowledge base, which I think makes a lot of sense. But I can see how, from a moral perspective, you would want to destroy it, because you can see how Holocaust survivors or the families of them would not want anyone to see that footage, because it would be too shameful to them, and it would just bring up too much trauma for them. I can understand that, which is why the aesthetics of depicting Holocaust in fiction is such a moral issue, right? Because it's such a fucking horrifying thing that happened, and how the way we decide to depict it is inevitably a moral position. Depending on what you decide, you're implicitly making a moral statement, whether you want to directly or not. So I understand that opinion. So then this is a great quote that he finishes off this essay with, or this paragraph in this essay anyway. When considered in this way, the pleasure of aesthetic fiction is not a simple form of escapism, but a mode of coping with traumatic memory, a survival mechanism. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a great quote. It's about how, kind of what I've alluded to a little bit here already, which is that one of the great purposes of art is to help us vicariously experience darkness, and empathizing with a person who's experiencing tragedy, like the Holocaust victims, and empathizing with them and being disturbed and overwhelmed and sad and angry about what happened to them, without actually having to have any risk to ourselves and suffer harm ourselves in the real world. So we can get a tiny little taste of what that was actually like for people, and it can really fuck us up perhaps, but it can also help us truly understand the darkness of that. And like I said, since if we're talking about it in the realm of fiction, it's historical fiction. So just like history, one of the purposes of fiction can be, if we're talking about historical fiction, it can be even more effective than a documentary or a nonfiction book in just helping us empathize with these people, especially if it focuses on specific characters, so we can understand the true darkness of the Holocaust, and the better we understand it, the more we can help learn the lessons of like what was so fucked up and all the factors that led to Hitler and the Holocaust, so that we can have a better chance of avoiding that kind of shit happening in the future. So hopefully that's what people can learn from the aesthetics of the way that the Holocaust is depicted in fiction. So yeah, anyway, I think that's a really interesting subject for this essay, and I think that Slavoj Ziziek has some really interesting thoughts on it, some of which I agree with, some of which I disagree with, and those are, like I said, those are my thoughts on that. And yeah, I'm going to talk about a whole bunch of other essays within this book, and then after Slavoj Žižek, I'm going on to other authors and their thoughts on Hegel as well, including Kant and many others. So yeah, let me know what you think about this subject in the comments here. Of course, it's extremely controversial, and people will probably have a lot of different opinions about it. And yeah, thanks for watching this video. And like I always say, thanks a lot to those of you who've subscribed to my channel. Please do if you haven't already, and click that bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. And also, especially thank you to those of you who are my patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate that more than anything else, and I'll add the link for my Patreon page in the description of this video, as I always do. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. And groove is in the heart. And learn about and think about the morality of depicting the Holocaust and other dark events in fiction, and the philosophical aspects of this, and what we can say about this as a society moving forward in the future. All right, so thanks again, everyone, and adios until next time.